So imagine that it is not a warm summer weekend. Actually, don't have to do so much imagining for that. But imagine that it is instead a bitterly cold winter afternoon. And a man is riding a horse to a distant village where he hopes to spend the night. The village is on the other side, is on the shore of Lake Constance. And he knows that he still has a ways to go before he gets there. He thinks he glimpses some lights in the distance, so he presses on, even though it's getting dark, and the cold is almost unbearable. The snow is swirling around him, but those lights twinkling on the horizon keep him pressing forward, urging his horse to keep going. After all this time, he finally arrives at the village, much later than he'd expected to. And something doesn't seem quite right when he gets there. He stops a woman on the street and asks her where he is, and the answer leaves him frozen in his tracks. In the blizzard, he overshot the village he intended to visit, and he's now clear on the other side of the lake. He thinks back on what he has just done, crossing this enormous lake in the dark. His horse could have gone through the ice at any moment, but now here he is, safe on the other side, his feet on steady, solid ground. The Swiss theologian Karl Barth used this story as an image for what it means to be saved by grace. You may not even have known it was happening, but here you are. You have crossed the perilous terrain. You are safe in this new place where you have arrived. You have been brought from death to life. This is the gift of life and salvation that God has given you. You are saved by grace. That kind of an image of a journey completed, of entering a whole new territory, is there in the background, and it's the basis for what Paul is talking about in this section of his letter to the Romans that we just read a few moments ago. The section where Paul is speaking in these broad, sweeping terms about the Christian life and salvation. Present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, he says in our reading this morning. You are already there. This has already happened. You are no longer in that old, deathly place, but in this place of life. Thanks be to God. It sounds pretty good, doesn't it? This business of arriving at life in all of its fullness. I like the way that sounds. But here is the thing. If I ever, even for a fraction of an instant, imagine I'm starting to arrive at anything like that, I do an excellent job of reminding myself very quickly that I am not yet there. Grumping to myself about somebody pushing ahead of me on the bus, or losing my patience with my kids, or getting stuck in despair when I read the news, or forgetting the one important thing that I had to do that day. I don't know about you, but when it comes to me, the evidence would certainly suggest that I have not yet arrived. So what do we do with this news that we have been brought from death to life, that we have already crossed this perilous frozen lake? I think our reading from Romans today lives right on this edge between what God has done for us in Jesus and what daily life is still like. In the passage just before this, one of the most beautiful and well-known in Romans, Paul talks about the way that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection completely reorients our life. The language he uses for this is baptism. Therefore, we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. You cannot talk about a much more all-encompassing change than that, from death to newness of life. And Paul says here that what happened to Jesus actually happens to you. Just as Jesus died and rose, so we die to an old self and rise to a new one. Jesus' story is not just some distant one about an untouchably holy person. It is actually our story, here and now. We are baptized into him, death, resurrection, and all. It's a done deal. This is who you are, Paul says. It all sounds great, except for that pesky fact that everything does not look like resurrection in our world or in our lives, if we're honest about it. We snap at the people we love the most. or we catch ourselves stuck on old prejudices or grudges, or we seek comfort and security in people or behaviors or possessions that can never give us what we really need. And we are inevitably snared in larger patterns of injustice in the world. You say we've crossed from death to life, Paul, but there is still this pesky fact that everything is not right. Paul gets this, and the word that he uses for it is sin. We don't use that word too much these days, of course, but when we do, we tend to use it in the plural, as in sins, individual missteps, actions that are harmful or wrong. The church is probably mostly responsible for this fact. It's done a lot of talking about individual sins, and it's often operated as though its job is to remind people of all the things they are not supposed to do, to make them aware of every crack in the pavement that they should try not to step on. Paul hardly ever uses the word this way, however. For him, sin is almost always in the singular. It's living out of alignment with what God intends for you. It's living in a fragmented way, apart from God, apart from others, apart from your own true self. And in that way, sin is a force. It's an allegiance. It's almost a place. You don't live there anymore, Paul says to the churches in Rome and to us. You have a new home. Sin will have no dominion over you, he writes in our passage today. You have been brought from death to life. That is the deepest truth about you. But it takes a while for that truth to sink in. It takes a while to become who God says we are. The best analogy I know for this also comes from the Bible. It's the story of the Exodus, of people who had grown accustomed to being slaves, finally being set free, being led through the waters to a new life on the other side. You would think that being set free was simple enough, that one day they were living under Pharaoh's rule and the next day they weren't. But the Bible tells us that it wasn't that simple. The Hebrew people really were free. Once Moses led them out of Egypt, there was no Pharaoh telling them to make bricks, no taskmaster telling them to work 7 days a week, no dehumanizing structure that valued them only for what they could make. They really were free. But it took a long time for that truth to sink in and permeate their lives, to figure out what to do with that freedom, to value life in this new and whole way, to value rest and worship and community for the purely good things that they are. It took 40 years, in fact, to become the free people God said they were. That's how long they were in the wilderness, adjusting to freedom, letting that story of liberation become their story. And that's what Paul is talking about here, I think. Present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and present your members as instruments of righteousness. You are free. You do not belong to sin, but to God. So now it's time to start acting that way. It's time to let that new reality sink into your bones, into your acting, into your being. Maybe that starts with calling out all the other voices that say you are something else, that say you are defined by your past mistakes, or by your paycheck, or by how much you can buy, or by your social status, or by your appearance. It starts with calling out those false voices and hearing who God says you are. God's own, free, brought from death to life. Now live as though that's true about you, Paul says, because it is. Maybe that is one way to think about what the Christian life really is. It is letting the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection become our story, becoming more and more who God says you are. Martin Luther says this beautifully, I think. This life, therefore, is not righteousness, but growth in righteousness. Not health, but healing. Not being, but becoming. Not rest, but exercise. We are not yet what we shall be, but we are growing toward it. The process is not yet finished, but it is going on. This is not the end, but it is the road. All does not yet gleam in glory, but all is being purified. All does not yet gleam in glory. We probably don't need to be told that. We mess things up all the time. That's another way of saying that sin is real. But remember, Paul says, it has no claim on you. You do not belong to sin, but to God. You are God's own. You have crossed the waters. The danger is behind you. All that's left is to continue becoming who God says you are. Amen.